My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 30 years old, and tonight I'm walking back into my parents' house for the first time in over a decade, the place where my dreams were dismissed before they even had a chance to grow, where I was told to be practical, to stay small, to leave ambition to others. The walls that once silenced me are glowing with lights and filled with guests, all gathered to celebrate my brother's triumph. He doesn't know it yet, but before the night is over, this party will no longer belong to him, it will be mine. If the people closest to you never believed in your dreams, hit like and subscribe, because I'll show you how I turned their disbelief into my strength. For as long as I can remember, my life in Chicago was measured against the brilliance of my older brother, Marcus. To my parents, he was everything they had ever hoped for in a child. Sharp, ambitious, and disciplined, Marcus had been groomed for success since he could hold a pencil. By the time he was 12, he was already winning debate competitions. By high school, he was shadowing lawyers through internships that my father secured with his endless networking. It seemed every dinner conversation circled back to Marcus's triumphs. Meanwhile, I existed in the periphery, present but overlooked, like a shadow cast against the wall. It wasn't as though I had nothing to offer. From the time I was young, I had an insatiable curiosity for natural health. I collected books on herbs, sketched out nutrition plans in notebooks, and woke up early to practice yoga in my bedroom while sunlight filtered through the blinds. Where Marcus argued about constitutional law at the dinner table, I tried to share a new herbal tea blend I had read about, or a yoga sequence that eased tension. The response was always the same: my father's distracted nod, my mother's absent smile, and Marcus's smirk. It didn't matter how enthusiastic I was, because in their eyes, what I cared about wasn't real. Not like law. Not like Marcus. My father, Harold Carter, was a senior manager at an accounting firm, and my mother, Barbara, had given up her nursing career to focus on raising us. Or rather, raising Marcus. She poured every ounce of herself into guiding him to the next milestone, from driving him to weekend mock trial tournaments to attending parent-teacher conferences dressed as though she were meeting a senator. If I needed a ride to a yoga workshop across town, I was told to take the bus. If I asked for money to buy a nutrition course online, the response was a clipped, "We don't waste money on hobbies." It wasn't said cruelly, but with such finality that I learned not to argue. The sharpest cut came at family gatherings. Our relatives adored Marcus, showering him with admiration. Aunt Lydia would pinch his cheek even at 16, declaring, "This one's going to be a senator, mark my words." Uncle James would slap him on the back, asking when he would finally start charging for legal advice. When the attention occasionally flickered to me, the words were soft, almost pitying. "You're such a sweet girl, Naomi," they'd say, as though kindness was my only defining trait. No one asked about my dreams, not once. I was invisible, my aspirations weightless against Marcus's polished shine. By the time I was 15, I had already begun to withdraw, retreating into a world of my own creation. I filled journals with meal plans, recipes, and reflections on the connection between mind and body. I spent hours in the public library, devouring books on holistic health, Ayurveda, meditation, and plant-based nutrition. I felt alive in those pages, validated in a way my family never made me feel. But every time I tried to share a discovery, the dismissal was quick. My mother would sigh, telling me it was fine as a hobby, but reminding me to focus on a career that matters. My father would remind me that the world respected doctors and lawyers, not folk remedies. And Marcus, with his endless confidence, would laugh outright. "You think people are going to pay you to tell them to eat vegetables?" The older I got, the sharper the divide grew. When Marcus graduated high school, my parents threw a lavish party, the kind of event you'd think was for a wedding. Relatives flew in from out of state, the living room filled with laughter and champagne as my father toasted his son, the future lawyer. That same year, when I won a small community award for leading a mindfulness group at school, my mother congratulated me with a pat on the shoulder and a reminder to start researching colleges, with real programs. She meant law, medicine, finance, anything but the path I dreamed of. Yet even with their rejection, my passion only deepened. Health wasn't a phase for me, it was survival. It was the one part of myself that felt solid and unshakable, even as the world ignored it. I clung to yoga mats bought from thrift stores, to recipe books with worn pages, to every scrap of validation I could find. But the cracks in my heart widened every day, and by my senior year of high school, the decision was clear. I couldn't keep living in a house where I was invisible. On the night of my 18th birthday, while Marcus was out celebrating his latest internship at a prestigious law firm, I sat in my room staring at the walls plastered with my vision boards. Pictures of serene retreats, wellness centers, and smiling clients I hoped one day to help stared back at me. My suitcase lay open on the bed, half filled with clothes, a small box of savings I'd squirreled away from babysitting jobs, and the second-hand laptop I'd bought off Craigslist. My yoga mat, worn thin at the edges, was rolled carefully at the side. I listened to the muffled sound of my parents laughing with Marcus downstairs, and for the first time, I knew I wasn't part of their world anymore. I zipped the suitcase closed, my hands trembling, my chest tight. I wasn't running away out of anger. I was leaving because I couldn't keep shrinking to fit into a space where I was never meant to exist. That night, without saying goodbye, I walked out the front door and into the humid Chicago air. The city lights stretched before me, buzzing and alive, a world I had never been allowed to claim. I didn't know how I would survive, but I knew this much: I would rather starve chasing my dream than suffocate living under theirs. The first weeks after I left home felt like standing on a cliff edge, both terrified and exhilarated by the space beneath me. I had no roadmap, only a stubborn belief that it was better to risk failure on my own terms than keep shrinking inside the house where I had never been seen. I found a small studio north of Logan Square, tucked into a weather-beaten brick building with narrow hallways that smelled faintly of dust and radiator heat. My room was barely large enough for a bed and a table, the window rattled whenever the blue line passed, and the heater groaned all night as if resenting the effort of keeping me warm. Still, it was mine. When I unrolled my frayed yoga mat on the scratched floorboards, I told the empty air, "This is home," and for the first time in years I almost believed it. Money dissolved quickly, as though each dollar carried holes I couldn't patch. Rent, bus fare, rice and beans, a second-hand saucepan from a church sale, even the prepaid phone plan I signed up for, it all slipped through my fingers before I had time to hold it. To make ends meet, I worked the late shift at a diner where the air was thick with fryer oil and burnt coffee. My hands memorized the rhythm of plates balanced on one arm, my face memorized the smiles I forced when customers snapped their fingers like I was a servant. In the mornings, I mopped the floors of a cramped gym in exchange for a discounted membership. I'd push the mop across the rubber tiles while dawn pinked the windows, telling myself that cleaning sweat from strangers' footprints was temporary. "This is scaffolding," I whispered one morning, leaning against the mop handle. "Not the house." Chicago's winter arrived like a test of endurance, slipping icy fingers through every gap in my thrift store coat. My hands cracked from cold water and bleach, my shoes leaked slush at the seams, and there were nights when exhaustion made me want to collapse on the floor instead of the mattress. Yet even on those nights, I forced myself to unroll the mat, moving through postures while the radiator coughed. Breath became my shield, reminding me that I was not wasting my life, I was investing in it, one difficult day at a time. The library became my sanctuary. I would sit for hours under the fluorescent lights, copying passages from books on anatomy and nutrition into a notebook already swollen with handwritten pages. There, surrounded by silence broken only by turning pages, I felt like someone with a purpose. Back in my apartment, I cooked simple meals on the single burner, experimenting with turmeric, ginger, and slow-simmered beans. The food was humble, but when I ate standing by the window, watching snow fall under the street lamp, I felt like I was building myself from the inside out. At the diner, I discovered that exhaustion lived in people's bodies long before it appeared in their words. A regular would complain about headaches, and I'd quietly mention the importance of drinking more water. Another sighed about his blood pressure, and I suggested gentle walks after meals. At first they brushed me off, but a few weeks later one man came back and said, "I tried that thing you told me, made a difference." His words settled inside me like a spark. Maybe I wasn't invisible after all. Sometimes, after closing, I scribbled quick tips on the backs of receipts: stretch while the kettle boils, breathe deeply before sleep, eat something green with dinner. It was small, but it mattered. The gym was another classroom, though no one knew I was a student. I lingered after cleaning, watching instructors lead classes with a rhythm that was equal parts authority and warmth. I studied how they cued breath, how they offered adjustments without judgment, how they built a roomful of strangers into a community. At night, alone in my apartment, I practiced those cues aloud, shaping a voice that had never been allowed at home. Some nights I laughed at myself, other nights I cried, but every time I tried again. My parents called twice that winter, leaving messages filled with thinly disguised disapproval. My mother asked if I had real plans yet. My father reminded me that spring enrollment deadlines were coming, as though the life I was choosing was just a childish phase. Listening to those messages tightened something in my chest, and I fought the urge to call back and justify myself. Instead, I laced up my worn boots and walked into the brittle cold until their voices lost their grip. I had chosen this path. Answering them would only weaken my steps. By spring, the city began to thaw, and with it my belief in my future grew stronger. I bought a second-hand bike and rode along the lake in the early mornings, the water flat and endless. With the wind biting my face, I felt free. Ideas spilled into my pockets, scrawled on torn envelopes, morning routines for real people, stretching you can actually keep, food that loves you back. At night I taped them above my desk, the ink scraps forming a crooked constellation of hope. Opportunity rarely announces itself. Mine came in the form of a faded flyer in the gym's vestibule. A yoga studio a few blocks away needed front desk help. The pay was modest, but it came with free classes and the chance to learn from trained instructors. My heart raced as I copied the number into my phone. At the library, I typed out a plain resume, printed it on thin paper, and carried it over before I could lose my nerve. The studio smelled faintly of eucalyptus and warm wood. Light poured across polished floors, softening the edges of the room, and I felt something stir in me the moment I stepped inside. The manager, a tired woman with kind eyes, listened as I explained why I wanted the job. I didn't lie or embellish. I simply said I was trying to build a life that helped people feel at home in their bodies, and I was ready to work as hard as it took. She nodded, decisive, and slid a clipboard toward me. When I walked back outside, schedule folded in my pocket, the streets looked different, no longer a maze I was lost inside, but a path that was finally leading somewhere. The yoga studio where I started working was unlike anywhere I had ever been employed. The diner had smelled of grease and impatience, the gym of sweat and bleach, but this place carried a different air, one that seemed to breathe with you the moment you walked through the glass doors. There was always a trace of eucalyptus in the air, faint music that hummed more than it played, and a sense of calm that clung to your skin even on the busiest days. My tasks were simple: fold towels, greet clients, manage check-ins, tidy mats, and keep the tea kettle filled. Yet even in those small routines, I felt like I had stepped closer to the life I wanted. Every folded towel was a quiet investment in my future. I didn't expect to be noticed, certainly not by the instructors who floated into classes with the serene confidence of people who knew their worth. But one evening, after a particularly busy shift, a woman lingered near the desk where I was wiping down counters. She was in her 50s, tall and spare, her dark hair threaded with silver and pulled neatly into a bun. Her eyes were sharp, the kind that saw more than most people wanted to reveal. She watched me finish my task before speaking. "You're not just here to fold towels, are you?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that left little room for pretense. I froze, cloth in hand. Well, no, I admitted. I want to learn. I want to teach eventually. I just don't know where to start. Her mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but it wasn't unkind either. "Good," she said simply, then introduced herself. "I'm Dr. Asha Patel. I teach the advanced classes on Tuesdays. Stay after next week. I'd like to see what you can do." The days leading up to that Tuesday were electric with nerves. I practiced sequences late at night in my apartment, whispering instructions to the empty room, trying to imagine what it would feel like to guide real people rather than shadows on the wall. When the evening finally arrived, I stayed after my shift, heart hammering as I joined a small group of advanced students. Asha's teaching was nothing like the casual classes I had observed. Every movement was precise, her cues layered with knowledge of anatomy and breath that felt almost surgical in their accuracy. It was intimidating, yet deeply inspiring. After class, when the last student left, Asha gestured for me to roll out my mat. "Show me what you know," she said. My body trembled as I moved through the postures I had practiced countless times alone. She circled me, adjusting an elbow here, a hip there, her hands firm but respectful. "Not bad," she said finally. "But you're leading with memory, not understanding. You know the shapes, but not the reasons behind them. That's what separates a hobby from a craft." It was the first time anyone had taken me seriously enough to critique me, and instead of shrinking, I felt myself expand. Asha began inviting me to her classes regularly, sometimes to observe, other times to practice under her eye. She explained alignment in a way that made sense of things I had only guessed at. She talked about breath like it was the body's language, about the nervous system as a quiet animal that could be soothed with the right cues, about the spine as a storyteller that remembered every choice we made. Her teaching reached far beyond yoga, it was a philosophy of living. One night, as we sipped tea after class, she leaned back in her chair and studied me. "You're serious about this," she said. "But seriousness alone isn't enough. You'll need training, yes, but you'll also need to understand people. Not just their bodies, but their lives. Why they come here, what they're carrying, what they hope to leave behind. If you can see them fully, you'll help them more than 1,000 perfect postures ever could." Her words struck something in me. I thought of the diner regulars who had softened after a simple suggestion, the gym clients whose shoulders loosened when someone spoke to them kindly. I had already seen glimpses of what she meant, though I hadn't known how to name it. Asha didn't coddle me. She was demanding in a way that forced me to rise higher. If my poses wavered, she told me to hold them longer. If my explanations were vague, she pressed me to find clearer language. She lent me books that were dense and technical, scribbling notes in the margins about passages to reread. Sometimes she dismissed my questions with a simple, "Find out yourself and tell me tomorrow," which sent me back to the library late at night, chasing answers I hadn't thought myself capable of finding. Through it all, she treated me not as a student to be humored but as someone worth investing in. That trust, more than anything, became my anchor. When she asked me to assist her in adjusting students during class, my hands shook, but she nodded approvingly afterward. "You have intuition," she said. "Don't be afraid of it. Precision will come, but trust what you already feel." Outside the studio, life remained difficult. Money was tight, my clothes threadbare, my apartment still little more than 4 walls and a rattling window. But inside the studio, under Asha's guidance, I felt rich in ways my family had never imagined. I was being shaped, not into the version they had always wanted, but into something wholly my own. Every lesson, every correction, every push past my comfort zone was another stitch in the fabric of the life I was building. One evening, as we locked up, Asha paused at the door. "You remind me of myself when I was your age," she said. "Hungry, stubborn, too used to being underestimated. That hunger will serve you, but only if you channel it. Don't waste energy trying to prove yourself to the wrong people. Pour it into the work. The results will speak for you." Her words echoed in my chest long after I biked home under the streetlights. For the first time since I had walked out of my parents' house, I believed, deep down, unshakably, that I wasn't lost. I was exactly where I needed to be. By the time summer had deepened, the rhythm of the studio had woven itself into my bones. I could fold towels and answer phones on instinct, my body carrying out the motions while my mind absorbed everything Asha poured into me. I lived for those hours when she pulled me aside after class, dissecting alignment or challenging me to explain the mechanics of a pose in simple terms. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of momentum, as though I was building something with weight and direction. Yet outside the studio, the reality of survival pressed constantly against me. Rent was due each month without sympathy, groceries had to be stretched carefully, and the thin cushion of savings I had carried with me from home had long since disappeared. It was in the middle of this fragile balance that the idea of starting something of my own began to take root. Not a full business, at least not yet, but small workshops, private sessions, perhaps a gathering at a community center where I could test my voice beyond the walls of the studio. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. I had no roadmap, no clear sense of what steps to take first, and though Asha encouraged me, she also reminded me that practicality mattered. Dream big, Naomi, she said one evening, but build carefully. Paperwork, insurance, the law, you must take those as seriously as the teaching. Her words lingered, and for the first time in months I thought about Marcus. If anyone knew how to navigate contracts and paperwork, it was him. The idea of calling my brother made my stomach twist, but another part of me, the part that still longed for family, for acknowledgement, whispered that maybe this could be a way to bridge the distance. Perhaps he would see that I was not a foolish girl chasing hobbies, but a woman with a vision and the discipline to pursue it. Perhaps he might even offer a kind of grudging respect. I dialed his number one Saturday afternoon, my hands trembling as the call rang. He answered quickly, his voice as crisp and confident as ever. Naomi, he said, sounding almost surprised. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I know, I replied. I wanted to ask for some advice. Legal advice, actually. That caught his attention. He laughed lightly. Well, that's a first. Go on. I explained, haltingly, about the studio, about Asha's mentorship, about the idea of offering my own small workshops. I spoke about contracts, liability, the questions I didn't know how to answer. For once, I laid my vulnerability bare, hoping he would meet it with something resembling the support I had always craved. There was silence on the other end, followed by a sharp burst of laughter. Not the gentle kind, but the laughter of someone who finds amusement in another's naivety. Naomi, he said finally, his voice dripping with disbelief, you left home to fold towels and stretch in front of strangers, and now you think you're starting a business? Do you even hear yourself? The sting was immediate, but I held the phone tighter. It's not just stretching, I said quietly. It's wellness, Marcus. It's helping people. And yes, I think I can turn it into something real. He chuckled again, louder this time. Something real? Come on. You had every chance to do something serious, to study something worthwhile, and instead you chose this nonsense. And now you want me to waste time helping you draft contracts for a fantasy? You should be grateful I even picked up the phone. His words landed like stones, heavy and cold. I had known there was a risk in reaching out, but some small, foolish part of me had still hoped he might surprise me. Instead, he had given me exactly what I should have expected, dismissal, condescension, and that familiar certainty that I would never measure up. I didn't call for charity, I said finally, my voice low but steady. I called because I thought, just maybe, you could respect what I'm building. Clearly, I was wrong. For a moment, silence hummed between us, and then he sighed in that way I knew so well, the sigh of someone washing their hands of a trivial matter. You'll figure it out when you fail, he said. Maybe then you'll finally realize Mom and Dad were right. I ended the call before he could say more, my thumb pressing down with a finality that reverberated through me. My hands shook as I set the phone aside, but the tears I expected never came. Instead, there was a fire, a hot, pulsing determination that spread through my chest like oxygen-catching flame. If Marcus could not see me, if he chose to laugh rather than listen, then so be it. His disbelief would not break me. It would forge me. That night I biked to the studio, even though I wasn't scheduled to work. The space was empty, the lights dim, the air heavy with silence. I rolled out my mat and moved through sequence after sequence until my muscles burned and sweat dripped down my back. Every inhale became a vow, every exhale a release of the weight my family had tried to press onto me. I moved until my body shook, until my breath came ragged, until all that remained was the clear, unwavering truth, I would build this life on my own. With or without them. When I finally lay on the floor, staring up at the ceiling, I thought of Asha's words, don't waste energy proving yourself to the wrong people. Marcus was the embodiment of those wrong people, and I understood now with a clarity that seared. His laughter had not destroyed me, it had handed me fuel. The next morning, I opened my notebook and began sketching out my first workshop in careful detail. I listed what I would need, who I could invite, how much I might charge. I didn't have the answers to every question, but I had something better, the certainty that I would no longer wait for permission. My brother's betrayal had shown me that I could never rely on my family for recognition. If I was to rise, it would be on my own terms, with my own two hands, and with the belief that my path was worthy, no matter who laughed at it. After the call with Marcus, something shifted in me. His laughter had stung, yes, but it had also clarified my purpose. I stopped hoping that my family might one day understand and began focusing instead on what I could create with the scraps of time, energy, and money I had. The workshop I began sketching in my notebook grew from vague ideas into a plan, messy at first, then more deliberate. I wanted to hold it at the community center a few blocks from the studio, a modest building with scuffed linoleum floors and folding chairs that creaked when you sat down. It wasn't glamorous, but it was accessible, and more importantly, affordable. I saved every dollar I could, skipping dinners out with coworkers and biking everywhere to avoid bus fare. I bartered with the manager at the gym, offering to clean for extra hours in exchange for the use of a back room for practice. Slowly, piece by piece, I assembled what I needed: flyers printed on cheap colored paper at the library, a borrowed speaker for gentle background music, a small collection of mats I found at a thrift shop. Each item felt like a step closer to a door I had been knocking on for years. Asha watched all of this quietly, occasionally asking questions but never offering to rescue me from the grind. "You'll value it more if you bleed for it," she said one evening as I showed her the draft of my flyer. "Anyone can step into something polished and ready. Building from scraps teaches you the truth about yourself." The night of the first workshop, I barely slept. My nerves were a buzzing hive under my skin, and I arrived an hour early to set up. The community center room was small and plain, its fluorescent lights humming overhead, but I arranged the mats carefully, set out pitchers of water, and placed a few candles along the front wall for warmth. I expected a flood of people, but when the door finally opened, only 8 participants trickled in: 2 elderly women who came together, a young mother with tired eyes, a middle-aged man who confessed he was there because his doctor had suggested he try stretching, and a few curious neighbors. 8 people. It was both humbling and terrifying. My hands shook as I welcomed them, my voice uncertain as I explained what we would do. But as the session began, something surprising happened. The words I had practiced alone in my apartment flowed more easily once I was speaking to real people. My breath steadied, my body moved with assurance, and I found myself watching not just their shapes but their faces. When the young mother sighed into a posture and her shoulders dropped a fraction, I felt it resonate in my chest. When the older women smiled at one another after balancing longer than they thought they could, I caught myself smiling too. By the end of the hour, the room had softened. The participants gathered their things slowly, as though reluctant to break the atmosphere. A few came up to thank me, their words simple but sincere. One of the women pressed my hand and said, "I haven't felt this relaxed in years." The man with the doctor's note told me, with a shy smile, that he hadn't thought he could get through the session but had surprised himself. Their feedback wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and it was enough to make me blink back tears as I cleaned up afterward. That night, I biked home with the cool air stinging my face, but the fire in my chest keeping me warm. 8 people had come. 8 people had trusted me enough to follow my guidance, and they had left lighter than they had arrived. To Marcus, to my parents, it might have seemed like nothing, a handful of strangers in a dingy room. But to me, it was the beginning of everything. The following week, 4 of them returned, and they brought friends. Soon I had a small group attending regularly. It wasn't much money, just a few bills collected in a jar to cover the room rental and supplies, but the consistency mattered more than the income. I was no longer practicing in a vacuum. I was building community, one breath at a time. Word spread slowly but steadily. The young mother invited another parent from her child's school. The older women convinced their neighbor to join. Each new face was a reminder that what I was doing mattered, even if only in small ripples. I began keeping a folder of feedback slips, scraps of paper where participants wrote about how they felt after a session. Reading them became a ritual, fuel for the days when doubt crept in and whispered Marcus's laughter back into my ear. Asha was careful not to let me grow complacent. She attended one of the workshops quietly, sitting at the back with her arms folded, and afterward offered blunt but invaluable feedback. Your pacing is too fast. You're trying to impress them instead of listening. Slow down. Make space for silence. Healing isn't about filling every second with noise. Her critique cut, but I took it to heart. The next week I slowed my voice, let silence linger, and watched as participants seemed to sink more deeply into themselves. It was a lesson I carried forward, not just in teaching but in life. Growth often comes from subtraction, not addition. By the end of that season, my workshops had grown to nearly 20 participants. The community center staff began asking if I wanted to reserve the room on a regular basis. I invested in better mats and cushions, using every dollar I earned from the sessions to improve the experience. For the first time, I felt a sense of financial momentum. It wasn't security yet, but it was possibility. One evening, as I packed up after a particularly full session, I paused to look around the empty room. The folding chairs stacked in the corner, the faint smell of sweat and candle wax, the echoes of laughter and breath, it all felt like evidence that I was no longer invisible. I had taken my brother's derision, my parents' dismissal, and turned it into fuel. This was proof, small but undeniable, that I could carve something real out of nothing. As I carried the box of mats to my bike, I thought again of Marcus's voice, mocking and sure of itself. A smile spread across my face. Let him laugh. While he measured his worth in courtroom victories and promotions, I was measuring mine in lives softened, in shoulders eased, in the quiet gratitude of strangers who were becoming more than that. My breakthrough had not come with headlines or awards. It had come with 8 people who had given me their trust, and with the certainty that from here, I would only rise higher. The workshops at the community center had given me confidence, but I knew they were only the first stepping stone. I couldn't stay hidden forever in a back room with flickering fluorescent lights and mats that smelled faintly of disinfectant. If I wanted to reach more people, if I wanted to prove not just to myself but to the world that wellness was not a hobby but a calling, I needed to shape an identity that people could recognize. The idea of a brand began to take root, not because I craved logos or glossy marketing, but because I wanted what I offered to have a name, something solid that people could carry away and share with others. I spent evenings at my cluttered kitchen table, sketching names on scraps of paper between bites of lentils and rice. Most sounded forced or hollow, but one evening, as my fingers cramped from writing, the phrase came to me so simply it felt like it had been waiting all along, Healing Hands by Naomi. It was plain, almost obvious, but it carried everything I wanted people to understand, that wellness was not abstract, not lofty, but something intimate and practical, something that lived in touch, breath, food, and presence. Healing wasn't a miracle. It was work, and I wanted my name tied to that work. Once I had the name, the rest followed slowly. I opened a free blog, cobbling together posts about mindful eating, simple morning routines, and stretches to undo the ache of long hours at a desk. I wasn't a polished writer, but I wrote the way I spoke to my workshop participants, honest and unpretentious. My words were sometimes clumsy, but they were real. I took photos with the cracked lens of my secondhand phone, editing them on free software until they looked decent enough. I printed more flyers, this time with Healing Hands by Naomi written boldly across the top, and left them at coffee shops, laundromats, and grocery stores where people lingered long enough to notice. The growth was incremental, but it was there. A stranger emailed me after reading one of my blog posts, thanking me for writing about sleep habits. Another sent a message through the blog, asking if I offered private sessions. I did, though at the time, private sessions meant me arriving at someone's small apartment with a bag of thrifted props and a notebook filled with sequences. The pay was modest, but the experience was priceless. Each time I stepped into someone's home, guiding them through breath or movement, I felt the scope of my work widen. One Saturday morning, I arrived early at the community center for a workshop, only to find a local lifestyle magazine photographer setting up in the hallway. A reporter had seen one of my flyers and wanted to do a short feature on affordable wellness options in the city. I was stunned, but agreed, posing awkwardly on my mat while trying not to look directly into the camera. The article was small, tucked near the back pages, but when it was published, my inbox filled with messages from people who had never met me. "I saw your name in Chicago Living," one woman wrote. "I'd love to join your next class." The response was overwhelming. My workshops doubled in size within weeks. Some sessions had more people than mats, and I improvised with chairs and blankets, refusing to turn anyone away. For the first time, the jar of bills I collected at the end of each workshop felt substantial. After paying rent and expenses, I had money left over, small, but enough to let me imagine stability. Through it all, Asha kept pushing me. She refused to let me coast on the wave of new attention. "A brand is not just a name," she reminded me one evening as we packed up the studio. "It's consistency. It's trust. Anyone can make something shiny for a moment, but only discipline makes it last." She handed me a stack of articles about the business side of wellness, taxes, liability, client management. "You wanted this," she said. "Now take it seriously." Her words anchored me when doubt began to creep in. There were days when exhaustion threatened to flatten me, when I felt stretched too thin between diner shifts, studio work, workshops, and blog posts. On those nights, Marcus's mocking voice would resurface in my mind, insisting I was wasting my life. But then I would open my folder of feedback slips, reread the words of people who had told me I had helped them sleep better, move more freely, or breathe with less fear, and the doubt would dissolve. By the end of that year, I was no longer a girl experimenting with ideas in a journal. I was Naomi Carter, founder of Healing Hands, with a small but growing presence in a city that had once felt indifferent to me. My workshops filled consistently, my private clients referred me to their friends, and my blog posts were being shared by people I had never met. It wasn't yet the empire I dreamed of, but it was proof that my path was viable. One evening, as I updated my blog with a new post titled, "Small Steps Toward Healing," I leaned back and stared at the screen. My brand had begun in scraps, cheap flyers, grainy photos, clumsy words, but now it had form and momentum. I thought of my parents, of Marcus, of all the years I had been told that wellness was a frivolous pursuit. They had been wrong. Healing wasn't a gamble. It was my work, my craft, my life. And I was only just beginning. Momentum, I was learning, has a way of building on itself once the first stones are set in motion. What began as a handful of community center workshops had swelled into a small but steady current, and that current soon began to sweep me into places I had only imagined. The blog, which I had thought of as a quiet side project, grew beyond my control when one of my posts, 5 Morning Habits to Reset Your Day, was shared by a popular fitness influencer. Overnight, my inbox flooded with messages. Some were simple notes of thanks from people who had tried the habits, others were requests for private coaching or speaking engagements. My blog traffic tripled within a week, and I realized that what I had been building in corners of Chicago was starting to reach further than I had dared hope. The sudden visibility felt unreal. I had spent years invisible in my own family's home, yet here were strangers in different states, and even different countries, writing to me as if my words had given them something they had been missing. It was humbling, and it was also terrifying. With attention came expectation. I felt pressure to publish more regularly, to refine my voice, to present myself not just as a local instructor but as a professional capable of speaking to thousands. There were nights when the weight of that expectation pressed on my chest until I could hardly breathe, but then I would reread the letters from people who said my writing had made them feel seen, and I remembered that this was the point. Not fame, not recognition, but connection. It was during this whirlwind that the first invitation arrived. A small wellness conference in Minneapolis wanted me to give a talk about practical mindfulness for everyday people. The email felt like a trick at first, something too good to be true, but after checking and rechecking the sender, I realized it was genuine. I nearly talked myself out of saying yes. I was still working part-time at the diner, still scraping by each month. But Asha insisted. "If you want this life, you cannot hide from it," she said, handing me a book on public speaking. "You have something to say. Don't let fear waste the opportunity. I accepted, and 2 months later I stood on a modest stage in a Minneapolis hotel ballroom, staring at an audience of 200 strangers. My palms sweated, my throat felt tight, but when I began to speak, the words flowed the way they always had in my workshops, simple, honest, unpretentious. I told them about breathing in line at the grocery store, about stretching while the kettle boiled, about finding healing in the cracks of an ordinary day. When the session ended, the applause stunned me. People lined up afterward to thank me, to ask questions, to buy access to my online sessions. It was the first time I felt, fully and without doubt, that my work had grown larger than the walls of any one room. That conference led to more invitations: Denver, Austin, Toronto. Each time, the audiences grew, and with them my confidence. I began hosting weekend retreats in Chicago, renting quiet houses on the outskirts of the city where participants could disconnect from the chaos of their lives. Those retreats became the heart of my brand. People came exhausted and skeptical, but left lighter, their faces open in ways they hadn't been when they arrived. Word of mouth spread quickly. Soon my retreats were filling within days of being announced. Publishers began to take notice. One afternoon, while sitting cross-legged on my apartment floor, I opened an email from a well-known publishing house offering me a book deal. My hands shook as I read the proposal, a book on everyday wellness, blending my story with practical guidance. The advance wasn't enormous, but it was more than I had ever seen in one place. I called Asha immediately, my voice trembling. She listened quietly before saying, "Say yes, Naomi. Write the book you needed when you were that invisible girl at home." The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I worked full-time on my book, balancing it with workshops, retreats, and speaking engagements. I wrote late into the night, pouring my story onto the page, about leaving home, about struggling to survive, about building healing hands from scraps and stubbornness. Writing forced me to face memories I had buried, the hollow sound of my father's indifference, the sharp edge of Marcus's laughter, the sting of my mother's sighs. But it also reminded me of my resilience, of how each dismissal had planted the determination that now fueled me. When the book was finally published, the response exceeded anything I had dared imagine. Reviews were kind, sales steady, and soon it was being translated into other languages. Messages poured in from readers across the globe: a woman in Brazil who had used my breathing techniques to manage stress, a teacher in Germany who had started a mindfulness group at her school inspired by my chapters, a man in India who said my words had given him the courage to leave a toxic job. My work had traveled farther than I ever had, and that thought filled me with awe. Financially, everything changed. My workshops now sold out weeks in advance, private clients waited months for openings, and the retreats became a cornerstone of my income. I was no longer choosing between groceries and rent. For the first time, I had savings, stability, and even the beginnings of staff: a part-time assistant to manage emails, a coordinator to handle logistics for events. Healing Hands was no longer a fragile idea. It was a thriving brand with momentum, credibility, and reach. Through it all, I held on to Asha's words about discipline and consistency. I refused to chase trends or gimmicks. Instead, I doubled down on authenticity, reminding myself daily why I had started: to make people feel seen, to remind them that healing was not reserved for the privileged or the perfect, but available to anyone willing to breathe, to move, to listen to their bodies. That commitment, I believe, was what carried me from local to global. And yet, amid the whirlwind of success, a quiet ache remained. My family knew nothing of this life I had built. I had not spoken to Marcus since the call where he had mocked me. My parents' numbers were still saved in my phone, though months slipped by without me daring to dial them. Part of me was grateful for the silence. Another part wondered what it would mean if they ever saw who I had become. For now, though, I let that ache rest at the edges. My world was expanding faster than I could have dreamed, and I needed all my energy to keep up. The invisible girl had become a woman whose name was known in places her family had never imagined. Healing Hands had gone from a jar of coins on a counter to a movement stretching across continents. And even if my parents never acknowledged it, even if Marcus never admitted he had been wrong, I knew the truth: I had stepped into the world on my own terms, and the world had chosen to listen. By the time my book had gone into its second printing and Healing Hands had become more than a local name, I thought I had finally outrun the shadow of my family. I had filled my life with new voices, new faces, new opportunities. My days were a rhythm of workshops, retreats, and writing deadlines. My evenings were often filled with speaking engagements or long phone calls with collaborators abroad. I told myself that the silence from home no longer mattered, that I had stitched myself into a different fabric of belonging. And for a while, I believed it. Then the phone call came. It was a late afternoon in early autumn, and I had just finished a private session with a client recovering from surgery. I was sitting at my desk in the showroom I had rented downtown, a space that smelled faintly of incense and lavender oil, when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another press inquiry or a scheduling issue, but something in me hesitated. Against my better judgment, I answered. Naomi? The voice was softer than I remembered, almost tentative. It took me a moment to place it. My mother. For a heartbeat I couldn't breathe. The last time I had heard her voice had been years ago, in voicemails filled with disappointment and clipped instructions. Now it carried something different, though I couldn't tell if it was weariness or guilt. Hello, I said, my voice careful. There was a pause. It's been such a long time, she said. I wasn't sure you'd pick up. I didn't answer that. Silence stretched, until she finally continued. We're having a party next month. For Marcus. He's being made partner at his firm. It's a big milestone. Family should be together. The words landed like stones in my chest. Family should be together. I thought of all the dinners where I had sat invisible while Marcus's achievements were toasted. I thought of the conversations where my dreams had been dismissed with a sigh. Now, after years of silence, I was being summoned back as a supporting character in his story yet again. Why now? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Another pause. Because it's important, she said finally. Because, you're still my daughter, Naomi. Her words were strange, almost rehearsed, and I could hear the unspoken truth beneath them. This wasn't about me. It was about Marcus, about appearances, about a family portrait with no empty chairs. I'll think about it, I said, before hanging up. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I tried to answer emails, tried to sketch new ideas for an upcoming retreat, but my mind kept circling back to the call. I hadn't seen Marcus since the day he mocked me over the phone, laughing at the idea of me starting a business. I hadn't been in the same room as my parents since the night I walked out with my suitcase. The thought of stepping back into that world, of subjecting myself to their cold assessments and Marcus's smugness, made my stomach twist. That evening I met Asha for tea. She studied me over the rim of her cup, her gaze sharp as ever. What's troubling you? She asked. I told her about the call, about the invitation, about the swirl of anger and dread that had taken root in me. She listened without interruption, then set her cup down. You don't owe them anything, she said firmly. You've built your life without their help. You don't need their approval. I know, I admitted. But part of me wonders what it would feel like to stand there as I am now. Not the invisible girl they dismissed, but the woman I've become. To show them that I'm not small anymore. Asha tilted her head. Then you must be clear about your reason for going. If it's to seek validation, you'll walk away wounded. But if it's to close the chapter for yourself, to see them without their power over you, then it might be worth it. Her words echoed later that night when I met with a close friend for dinner. He leaned forward as I explained the dilemma, his expression thoughtful. You've faced tougher crowds than your family, he reminded me. Publishers, audiences, critics. Why should a living room full of relatives scare you more than a ballroom full of strangers? Because they had once made me small, I thought, though I didn't say it aloud. They had written the script of who I was supposed to be, and for years I had played it silently. But maybe walking into that party wasn't about them at all. Maybe it was about proving to myself that I no longer needed to play by their rules. For the next few weeks, the invitation lingered at the edge of my thoughts. My work carried on, retreats, events, planning the next steps for healing hands. But every quiet moment was filled with the same questions. Could I face Marcus's smirk without crumbling? Could I withstand my mother's sighs, my father's silence, without shrinking back into that girl I used to be? The decision came one evening as I walked home along the lakefront. The city lights shimmered against the water, and for the first time in years, I felt the full distance between who I had been and who I had become. I was no longer a girl scribbling ideas in a notebook, or a server balancing plates in a greasy diner. I was the founder of a thriving brand, a published author, a woman who had carved a life from nothing. I didn't need my family's recognition, but perhaps I needed to prove to myself that their dismissal no longer defined me. The next morning, I called my mother back. My voice was calm, steady, as I said, "I'll be there." She sounded surprised, her voice catching as she replied, "That's wonderful, Naomi. It's at the house, 7 o'clock. We'll see you then." I hung up quickly, unwilling to linger in the awkwardness of small talk. My hands trembled slightly, but it wasn't fear. It was resolve. I wasn't going to the party to celebrate Marcus. I wasn't going for them at all. I was going for me, to face the shadows of my past and prove that they no longer held me captive. The evening of the gala arrived far sooner than I was ready for, though readiness may have been an illusion all along. I stood before my mirror in the hours leading up to it, adjusting the folds of a long, deep blue dress I had chosen from my own line. It wasn't ostentatious, but it carried my signature: clean lines, flowing movement, a quiet strength stitched into every seam. I had decided that if I was going to step back into my family's orbit, I would do so clothed in the work that had defined me, not in anything they might interpret as borrowed or accidental. This dress was proof of the life I had built, of the woman I had become. As I drove through the streets of Chicago toward the neighborhood where I had grown up, my chest tightened. Each block felt like a step backward in time, a retracing of wounds I had tried to heal. When I finally turned onto the street where my parents' house stood, strung with lights for the occasion, I paused with my hands on the steering wheel. Through the wide windows I could already see the shadows of guests moving about, the glitter of glasses raised in toast, the familiar hum of celebration. It looked exactly as it had the last time I had been inside, a stage set for Marcus to shine. The front door opened before I reached it, and there stood my mother, dressed in a sleek gown, her smile practiced and brittle. "Naomi," she said, as if the word itself surprised her. Her eyes flicked over my dress, but no comment followed. She stepped aside to let me in, and the moment I crossed the threshold the past pressed against me. The cream-colored walls were the same, lined with framed photographs of Marcus at every stage of life: debate trophies, law school graduation, awards dinners. My face appeared only occasionally, usually at the edge of a group shot, half forgotten. The house was buzzing with guests, partners from Marcus's firm, extended family, neighbors. Conversations swirled in bright, brittle tones. I caught my father near the fireplace, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable as he nodded along to someone else's praise of Marcus's brilliance. He didn't notice me at first, and I wasn't ready to seek him out. Instead, I slipped deeper into the crowd, the hum of voices surrounding me like a tide. Then I saw him. Marcus stood near the center of the room, dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of money and power, his arm draped casually around the shoulders of his wife. His laugh carried across the room, confident and full. When his eyes landed on me, the sound faltered for a fraction of a second before he composed himself. He excused himself from the circle of admirers and approached, his smile sharp as glass. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Naomi. You actually showed up. I half expected you to be too busy teaching people how to breathe." Laughter rippled from a few onlookers, eager to mirror his tone. I kept my spine straight, my voice calm. "Good to see you too, Marcus." His wife leaned in then, her arm tightening around him. "So this is the famous little sister," she said with a smirk. "I've heard you've gone alternative. Yoga, wasn't it? That's sweet." Her words, meant as a barb, drew another wave of chuckles. The room had begun to notice us now, curiosity turning eyes in my direction. I could feel the old ache stirring, the familiar instinct to shrink back, to fold in on myself and let Marcus claim the stage. But I was no longer that girl. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single card, its embossed gold letters catching the light. Healing Hands by Naomi. I extended it toward Marcus's wife with a steady hand. Actually, I said evenly, it's a wellness brand. We just sold out our latest international retreat, and my book was translated into 3 languages this year. She blinked, the smirk faltering. Marcus, sensing the shift, snatched the card from her fingers and glanced down. His brow furrowed. Healing Hands? He read aloud, his voice meant to mock, but then his eyes flicked back to the card. Wait, this is you? Naomi Carter, best-selling author, founder of an international wellness company? The crowd pressed closer. Phones appeared in hands. Someone typed quickly, and within moments I could hear the murmurs. She's the one who spoke in Toronto last spring. Didn't she have that feature in Chicago Living? I read her book, she's incredible. The energy in the room shifted, like a current turning. Marcus's laugh faltered. His wife glanced nervously at her phone, scrolling quickly before her face paled. She's telling the truth, she whispered. My mother appeared at my side then, her wine glass frozen midair, her eyes darting between Marcus and me as if she no longer knew how the scene had slipped from her grasp. Naomi, she said softly, I didn't realize. I turned to her, my gaze steady. You never asked. The silence that followed was heavy, punctured only by the shuffle of guests repositioning themselves closer to me, their questions tumbling over one another. What's your next retreat? Do you take corporate clients? I saw your article on mindful eating, brilliant work. Marcus stood frozen, his jaw tight, his carefully curated authority crumbling. His wife's hand slipped from his arm. My father remained near the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the carpet, unwilling or unable to meet mine. For once, I didn't care. Their silence no longer carried the power it once had. I answered the questions, smiling faintly, my voice steady. The business card that had once felt like a shield had become a beacon, proof of everything I had built. I had not come to this party for applause, but the reversal was undeniable. What had begun as Marcus's night had turned, quietly and irrevocably, into mine. Later, as the room buzzed with whispers and glances, Asha's words returned to me, don't waste energy proving yourself to the wrong people. The work will speak for you. She had been right. My work had spoken louder than any defense I could have mounted. When I finally left that night, slipping out into the cool air, I felt lighter than I had in years. Marcus's smirk, my parents' indifference, the laughter of relatives, all of it had lost its sting. I had faced the room that once made me feel invisible, and I had not just survived it. I had risen above it. The days after the gala felt strangely quiet. For so long I had imagined what it might be like to face my family again, to stand in that house where I had once been invisible, and now that it had happened, I found myself replaying it less than I expected. I thought there would be endless loops of Marcus's stunned expression, my mother's faltering words, my father's silence. But instead, what lingered most was the absence of weight in my chest. It was as though I had been carrying a heavy stone for years without realizing it, and in one evening it had slipped from my hands. I had gone back into the lion's den and discovered the lions had no teeth. Still, the aftermath was not without ripples. Within days, I received a string of hesitant emails from relatives who had been at the gala. Some were congratulatory, full of sudden admiration that had never existed before. Others tried to smooth over old dismissals with casual remarks like, "We always knew you'd do something special." I responded politely but briefly, unwilling to rewrite history just because they now saw value in my success. I had no interest in being celebrated only after the world had confirmed my worth. What surprised me most was a voicemail from my mother a week later. Her voice cracked as she said, "Naomi, I'm proud of you. I don't think I ever told you that before." There was a pause, then a sigh. "I'd like to talk, if you'll let me." I listened to it twice before deleting it. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. I had waited years for those words, but they no longer carried the power they once might have. They could not erase the silence of my childhood, the years of being told I was a dreamer chasing foolish hobbies. Her pride now was not about me, it was about what I had achieved in spite of her. I didn't need it. My father never reached out, and Marcus, predictably, remained silent as well. That, too, felt like release. I no longer expected or desired apologies. I had built Healing Hands without their recognition, and I would continue building it without their permission. My family's absence had once been an open wound. Now it was simply a scar, evidence of survival, but no longer a source of pain. Meanwhile, my work continued to expand. Retreats sold out within hours of announcement. Corporations began reaching out to book me for employee wellness programs, a development I had once thought impossible. The book's sales remained steady, and my publisher pressed me for a second manuscript. I hired 2 more team members to help with logistics, freeing me to focus on the part that had always mattered most, being present with people, helping them rediscover what their bodies and minds already knew. At the heart of it all, I kept reminding myself that success was not about the scale of the audience or the size of the contracts. It was about the woman who stopped me in the grocery store to say my breathing exercise had helped her through panic attacks. It was about the man who had avoided yoga his whole life but now sent me an email describing how his back pain had eased. It was about the teenager who came to a retreat with her mother and told me, through shy tears, that she finally felt seen. These moments were not headlines, but they were the quiet proof that Healing Hands was living up to its name. On quiet nights, I would still unroll my mat in the same way I had when I was 18, alone in my tiny apartment with the radiator rattling. The space around me was larger now, the mat newer, but the practice was the same. Each breath was a reminder of where I had come from, each posture a vow to remain grounded. Success had not erased the girl who once worked double shifts just to afford groceries. She lived within me still, keeping me humble, keeping me grateful. Sometimes I wondered if my path might one day intersect with my family again, not at a gala, not in a moment of public spectacle, but quietly, in the private corners of life. If it did, I decided, would meet it with calm. Not forgiveness offered as a gift, not reconciliation forced out of duty, but acceptance that they were who they were, and I was who I had become. My healing was not dependent on theirs. The morning of my 30th birthday, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the city stretch awake below me. The sun glowed against the skyline, and the air carried that fleeting freshness of early morning. I held a cup of tea in my hands, its warmth seeping into my palms, and thought about the girl I had been a decade earlier, the girl who had walked away from her parents' house with a single suitcase, trembling but determined. She would never have believed this life was possible, the retreats, the book, the community, the peace. Yet every step I had taken since that night had led me here. Family, I realized, was not the people who shared your blood. Family was those who saw you, who lifted you, who chose you. Asha had been family long before I admitted it. My team, my clients, the growing community of Healing Hands, all of them were family, woven together not by obligation but by respect. I no longer needed to chase love where it had never existed. I was surrounded by it now, abundant and undeniable. I raised my cup to the horizon and whispered a promise to myself: I would keep building, keep creating, keep healing, not to prove my worth to anyone, not to rewrite the past, but because this was who I was. The forgotten daughter had become her own foundation. And from here, there was no limit to how high I could rise. And now, I want to hear your stories too. Share in the comments if your own relatives once doubted you, and how it shaped the person you've become.